What's up, ladies and gentlemen of the internet? How are you guys doing? My name is Matt LeGrand, and on this channel, we're always talking about triathlon stuff. And in this particular video, I've gathered 5 triathlon coaches, and I've asked them, a series of questions. One of the questions that I'm particularly interested in asking these guys is, what mistakes do they see new triathletes making? So let's hop into it. Okay, so you coach a fair amount of athletes, you help out a lot of people. What mistake do you see new triathletes make in our sport?
The most common one, easily the most common, is everyone goes too hard in their first season. It's a learning curve. I would imagine you and me included in that. Yeah. My first season, I went every single session so hard, like as hard as I could, trying to get faster each, because in my head I was like, if I run faster, I am faster. Right. But actually, what I've learned and what I try and tell people is that you have to take your ego, put it in a box, put it away, and go slower than you even think you should, because all of the juicy base benefits that you need to actually go hard are down in the low zones where you really don't even feel like you're working hard. And it's a trick of the mind, isn't it, I think?
Absolutely, yeah. I think I talked to my athlete, like one of my high school athletes yesterday or something like that, and we were actually in the weight room, and they were just like, yeah, I think I should go and do something hard today. It was supposed to be like an easy day. And I said something similar, like your body, this is when your body is actually getting faster, when it's recovering from the strain that you put it under. If you want to get faster, you have to have the easy days. It's just like weightlifting, right? Where it's like, strain it and then rest and recover, and that's when you're building muscle and adaptation is taking place. And so it's like it's tough to convince high school kids that they shouldn't go hard all the time.
It's tough to convince anyone, I think. I think triathletes' mindsets, we're triathletes because we like pushing ourselves to the limits, and then to tell someone that you shouldn't push yourself to the limits in training is almost counterintuitive, because they're like, well, that's why I'm here. I've had so many people do that and almost can't grasp it until I send them, you almost have to send some people research papers that prove that point, or a magazine article, because otherwise they're just going to flog themselves.
Right. Yeah. That's a tricky thing to learn. Took all of us a long time.
Yeah, I'm still learning it, kind of. Like, I went out for a run the other day, and my heart rate was higher than it should have been for the run that I was doing, but I was just enjoying it, and I got carried away, and I was like, oh, this feels nice. And then you have to kind of go, just wind your neck in, Bridges, take it down a notch. Yeah. And that was, that's the key. It's just continually making sure your ego's in check.
Mr. Dusty Spiller, what are some common mistakes that you see new triathletes making?
I see a lot of mistakes from new triathletes when they come into the sport, but I think I've narrowed it down to my top 3 biggest mistakes that they make. First off, I would say a lot of new triathletes are guilty of going way too hard in training, especially with social media and YouTube. You'll go on a pro's social media channel and see some of the work that they're doing, and one day that you hope to aspire to. And a lot of times new triathletes think that they can just apply that training plan to themselves, and more often than not, they'll get very, very burnt out. So you need to do what works for you, and just because your friend or a pro triathlete is training 15, 20, 25 hours a week doesn't mean that that's what's going to work for you. Second biggest mistake I see from new triathletes is this obsession with having to get all the gear possible. Triathlon is expensive, but you really don't need to spend that much money to get into the sport. You don't need a $10,000 bike. You don't need 4 pairs of shoes. You don't need a $400 aero helmet. You can get by with a lot less, and I definitely recommend doing that for your first year in triathlon. If you're a new triathlete, make sure that you actually like the sport before you drop tens of thousands of dollars committing to this lifestyle. And lastly, another mistake that I see a lot of new triathletes making is the pressure to feel like you need to do an Ironman. If you're a triathlete, eventually someone's going to ask you if you've done an Ironman or done the World Championships in Kona. And you know what? You don't have to do an Ironman. You don't have to race for that long if you don't want to. You can stick to half Ironmans or 70.3s, or you can just do sprints and Olympics. It's totally up to you, and you shouldn't feel any pressure to have to step up and do an Ironman if you don't want to.
You guys coach a lot of athletes, of different abilities and definitely a lot of different actual styles of races and things like that. But what mistakes do you see new triathletes making?
Personally, I think that the biggest mistake that triathletes make is diving right into long course straight away and never actually learning to love the sport. The first thing they learn is that triathlon takes massive sacrifice, sometimes in detriment to your work, your family life, your social life, but it doesn't have to be that way. So I just think they learn that this is like it just takes so much from you instead of giving so much to you. I try as hard as I can when I take on a new athlete. Half the time they're coming to you for a long course training, kind of program. But, the sad thing is that people get into it so fast, they get to the point where it's taken so much from them and then they leave the sport, within a short amount of time and we never see them again. They've checked that Ironman box and they're gone.
Yeah. Get into it fast and get out of it fast, unfortunately.
That's probably the biggest thing. I think you do that and you also miss the big community aspect of triathlon, because going to a local sprint or Olympic tri or regional or whatever, the atmosphere is completely different to an Ironman or that level of a race where you go there and nobody talks to anybody really. And it's not always like that, but it's, people are a little more standoffish at races like that because you don't really know anybody. Unless you go with a group, you're one of a few thousand and everybody's kind of eyeballing each other. And, even after the race, you don't necessarily chat with people quite as much. Whereas local races, all the ones that we have, at least here in the Memphis area, you get done and everybody's hanging out, having a beer together and telling war stories and making fun of themselves. And,
and I see that in cycling too, where it's just like you kind of have that let's talk about the race moment, right? Where, everyone's kind of gathering around and just talking about it. Like, that's what we went through, or that was crazy when this happened.
Yeah. It's a similar atmosphere. I think triathlon does a little bit better job at kind of making people congregate a little bit more after, cycling being a little bit more of a team sport too. Half the time it's like this team goes in their little corner and whatnot. But generally I see like in a triathlon, it's just everybody's kind of hanging out together. So there's a massive community aspect to it that people miss when they just kind of, like you said, get into it fast and get out of it fast.
So one of the bits about having coaches on board for these interviews is kind of taking their perspective because they do get to see a lot of athletes. So what mistakes do you see new triathletes making?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I actually think the biggest mistake I see new athletes taking is the same one that a lot of experienced athletes make, bizarrely, and it's to do with just fixating on an A race and not thinking about what comes after that A race. Particularly when it comes to things like Ironman, the amount of, you all know people that they spend 18 months or 2 years focusing on an A race for an Ironman,
right? And
then they don't touch the bike or they don't run for 2 years afterwards because they haven't thought about the kind of long term. And I think a lot of new athletes come into the sport doing the same thing. They'll pick a sprint race or an Olympic and they'll fixate on that, and the minute it's finished they don't think about what they're going to do next. And I think coaching that and kind of just saying, look, in the lead up to this race, let's do this, let's do that, and then afterwards, what are you going to do afterwards? Let's pick a run, a 10K or something. And if you think about something like an Ironman, just imagine the sort of season of sprint and Olympic races you could have after 2 years of all that base training. You could have a really fun, fast, year of just doing shorter races. So I think that's the thing is people fixating on just one point in the season and not thinking about the whole year or 18 months even. Maybe that again has come from the music industry, because we work in kind of 18-month blocks where you have an album cycle and touring and then festivals, and it's all kind of rolls into the next thing. And I think that's possibly where people go wrong sometimes. It frustrates me a little bit when people kind of, they join our local club and they come and train with us, and they're really amazing athletes and they work really, really hard, and then you bump into them on the high street 2 years later and they I haven't done anything, man, and they're like 30 kilos heavier, and you should come back to it, man.
I know.
It's a shame.
Yeah, because it's the people too, right? It's like, wish you would come back, because the training is fun. It's fun to train with you or whatever it is, and you see them and they're doing other stuff. So,
I mean, nobody runs harder for an interval session than they do when they're in a group. And as much as it's an individual sport, training in a group is great, probably with the exception of the bike. I like to train on the bike on my own. But with running and swimming, for hard efforts, I have to be in a squad to do that. So yeah, I miss those guys. When they disappear, you're kind of like, and you see all their gear on eBay and stuff, you're like, oh dude, it's such a shame. They've got all this nice kit and they've trained really hard, and then they're back to being sedentary and not doing anything. It's a shame.
Yeah, totally see those guys, at the grocery store or whatever it is, and I'm like, hey, I miss training with you.
Yeah, exactly.
What mistakes do you see new triathletes make?
I think a lot of athletes, when they start the sport, they become too involved. They go all in too fast. They don't ease into the sport, and unfortunately, it leads to burnout. We have a lot of people who enter triathlon and think, oh, I need to do an Ironman, and it's a bucket list. So that's all they do. Right. And then once they do it, they leave. So people get too involved, and it becomes an obsession. And I think there has to be a balanced approach to the sport and looking at it as a lifestyle, not this is all I do, sacrificing family, work, social, because it becomes their everything. And it needs to be more of a understanding of why you're doing it. So you ask yourself, what's my why of getting into the sport? Is it bucket list? Great, do it and go. Or if you get into it, don't make it all encompassing. It has to be a piece of your life, not your life, at the sacrifice of your family. And people do that, and at times there's resentment by the spouse, the boyfriend, girlfriend, the family of like, oh, there goes dad, there goes mom going on their 4-hour bike ride again. We'll see them maybe later. And that's not healthy.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of the other coaches I've interviewed have mentioned something similar. So I really wonder if you guys are seeing something that a lot of people in the sport don't realize. So I think that's really good insight.
Yeah, and I've experienced that myself, and I've seen that in my circle where I've heard the stories, and I see it currently where they've had marital problems because there is the resentment. People are spending so much time away, and maybe one of the spouses or girlfriends, boyfriends isn't a triathlete, and they don't understand what the obsession is. And they see you hanging around other people who are healthy and fit, and there can be some jealousy, and that's definitely not healthy. So, there really needs to be a better approach to the sport and getting someone involved. And they see you out going and think you're having fun, and you are having fun, but it's such a selfish sport. And I found myself being selfish early on of this is who I am, this is my identity, and it's not. It's something you do, and you should have fun at it. Of course, there's a certain level, the elites who it is their job, or they have sponsorship obligations. But it needs to be a healthier approach.
And I want to give a huge thanks to all 5 of these coaches for taking the time out of their schedule to just sit down and chat with me about all of these issues. And each one of these coaches actually has YouTube channels themselves. So I'll be sure to link to every single one of these guys down below in the description of this video. Be sure to hop over and click on their particular channels, subscribe, and check them out. All right, guys, if you're into this sort of stuff, and that would be swimming, biking, or running, consider subscribing. There's a little subscribe button down below here somewhere. There's also a little notification bell, and that notification bell just allows you to be notified of whenever I post new videos, which I try to do about once per week. All right, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and we will see you guys on the next one.